Welcome to the Energy Desk, a weekly series from Mobius Risk Group analyzing the macro and fundamental trends shaping global energy markets. To take a closer look at any topics discussed on today's episode, head over to our research archive at research.mobiusriskgroup.com. Let's dive in. All right, we are back again on the Energy Desk, sitting here on Friday, January 24th, just about midday. Zane, how's it going?
Great. I think there's so much to talk about this week. This is going to be an exercise in how concise we can be. So I don't know. I think openers, big picture, we've had an inauguration and we have had machine gun fire in the way of executive orders, and it doesn't seem like we're anywhere near out of ammunition. We've got some extreme cold blanketing the lower 48, causing all kinds of interesting dynamics in power and gas markets. And there's even some maybe not quite as explosively interesting news out of Europe. I don't know. Let's start maybe with executive orders. The list is too long, and you wrote a great piece this week providing some color. I don't know. Maybe pick one of your favorites or even a quote specifically from them to get us started.
Yeah, no, it's definitely kicking it off hot on Monday with just a challenge to keep track of the number of executive orders and what exactly they mean. But I think where we can kick it off is probably with one of the Monday executive orders for declaring a national energy emergency. I think this kind of covers the umbrella of several others that were released on Monday. High level is that President Trump executive order to grant emergency permitting and regulatory rights permissions to several agencies and departments to expedite energy project approvals. What does that mean? Really just kind of taking advantage of, say, the U.S. Army Corps to get, special permissions to build some sort of energy infrastructure faster, go through the regulatory hurdles without as much friction, and kind of tie it into his much longer executive order, which was titled Unleashing American Energy. I think this is kind of one where we can focus for a little bit of time. I think one of the most important takeaways that it offered was kind of these nine policies that he outlaid that kind of give a good, clear direction of where he would like to go and where I think the priorities might lie for the next 4 years. I think I won't go through all of them. The kind of biggest ones, we want to encourage energy exploration and production on federal lands, including on the outer continental shelf. So as part of that, we just had President Biden, before he made his exit, added some new barriers to oil and gas production in those outer continental shelf areas for leasing. And so we're rolling those back. Then we have some other commentary on non-fuel minerals, really want to establish a uranium supply chain. I think that's another important one for people to keep in mind with this kind of hunt for nuclear generation. Our current nuclear supply chain is largely dominated by outside players, a lot of Russian influence in our nuclear fuel supply chain. And to scale our domestic fuels, we need to have domestic production. We've talked about this before. And then I think, there's a few more in there, but I think the EV mandates and some of the regulatory parameters or rules that the EPA has done, those will be in question. But he rolled back Biden's so-called EV mandate, those targeting 50% EVs by 2030. And kind of within this broader category is really trying to just roll back all of these regulations that were limiting consumer choice about what they can put in their homes, what kind of appliances they can use, and what kind of fuels can power those appliances. So, I'll kind of leave it there. I will encourage people who are interested just to go and take a look. We have all this in our research archive, just the 9 very clearly outlaid. And I'll kind of stop there.
I'm gonna pick on you a little bit. I can't help it. And if so far as the start, our efforts to be concise, and it's not your fault. We'll blame it on President Trump. That was a lot.
It was a lot.
You just matched his executive orders with the pace and the ability to try to recap it. I mean, great job. I guess same statement. Reiterate. please go do some reading. Alex has covered them in great detail. I don't know. One of my first thoughts is just can't help but see the irony in the fact that the incoming administration and many of the critiques of the outgoing administration pointed to agency overreach, essentially non-elected officials being given too much authority to go do whatever it is they wanted to do. And then the national emergency comes right in and says, hey, executive agencies, go do whatever it is that you want to do. And actually, I'm going to try to tell you what to do. I mean, I think it's hard to make heads or tails of, any real tangible impacts in the near term. And in some ways you can see crude and product markets have expressed as much, while slightly lower as we've moved through the week since Inauguration Day, nothing substantial. And if we look at that in the bigger picture of how long the spec community had gotten going into Inauguration Day, backpedaling a little bit may just be a bit of position squaring, saying, okay, well, I got what I could get. Let's see what comes next. I think overall, the executive orders screen bullish fossil fuels and bearish power. If I'm rolling back all these EV mandates, and even if you go into the household appliances, not like, a bunch of electric ranges across the country and wiping out gas ones would have any tangible impact. But, let's just say symbolically, that's the way it reads, which I think is a great segue to what came out of what came after the first flurry. And I don't know, maybe a quick recap on the Stargate project.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, first day, definitely not as much bullish factors for power per se, but come in day two, and while not an executive order, he did announce on behalf of the joint venture, but this $500 billion Stargate project, which is a joint venture between OpenAI, Oracle, SoftBank, a few others, definitely covered quite a bit in the broader media. So I'm sure people listening to this are familiar, at least on a high level. But the initial commitment of about $100 billion to build the first hyperscale data center and campus and associated infrastructure in Texas, specifically in North Texas and outside of Dallas. And what does this really mean? Hyperscale data centers, I think it's kind of hard for some people to extract a takeaway. I think there's really 2/3 points. So the scale, gigawatt scale data centers, as the name implies, that is their kind of instantaneous power consumption, capacity. So like the capacity for their demand is, say, 1 gigawatt or more. They're talking about facilities that will be as large as 5 gigawatts. And just for kind of easy numbers, what does that mean? A 5 gigawatt facility running at full capacity for a single year would be about 1% of the entire US annual electricity consumption. So if we're talking about multiple facilities that are going to be deploying as large as 5 gigawatt facilities over the next 4 years, it's something definitely to keep an eye on. And then that kind of gets us to the second and third point, why Texas? And I think it's fairly straightforward to say there's 2 points to that. One, the regulatory burdens that have been plaguing the industry, saying, hey, how are we going to get this much power? How can we kind of develop the infrastructure that we need without having 4 years of just waiting and waiting? I think Texas is probably the most friendly state that they can find to develop this infrastructure. But I think the second point is more interesting, and that is the energy problem, especially for these AI applications. And I think one of these quotes from Sam Altman is pretty interesting. Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, who in a Reddit AMA Ask Me Anything last October, one of his comments deep in the thread was in response to somebody's question about the speed that they're going to roll out new models. And his response was that the models are getting so complex, so advanced, and as a result, their energy consumption is getting more and more substantial, is that they have to allocate their compute capacity to say, okay, how many models can we develop at one time? And right now they're having to prioritize just doing one model or a handful of models instead of doing all of the applications that they would like to. And by coming down to Texas, you're accessing one of the most energy abundant regions of the United States. And I think that there's a lot of tailwinds for that. Do you have any takes on that before we kind of talk about what this might mean?
I mean, I was first, I think, flagging and maybe an even more grandiose perspective, but certainly true, not just states, one of the most energy rich locations in the world. North Texas is a little bit interesting in terms of the geographic choice. It's not as energy rich as, say, west or south or even east. However, it makes sense when you think proximity to as many metro areas as you can get. You go bury something in South Texas, or you're better suited to serve Mexico City than you are, say, Kansas City, Chicago, Denver. The energy issue that is facing really the entire AI theme and the data centers, I think we've covered in great detail on the podcast. So I'm trying to go back to the idea of how concise can we be. I'll stay off of that and just point out, or I guess maybe amplify what you talked about with the regulatory environment. I think it's an interesting issue in that Texas is longstanding one of the most friendliest places in the country to develop energy infrastructure. And at this scale, does that begin to change landowner interest? And if history serves as a guide, landowners in Texas have become some of the most astute in terms of what can they extract in terms of value from their land, their resources. And so does it become a money grab, and not in a negative sense? Stick your hand out and say, if you want to do it here, you're going to have to pay me for it. So I think that's the interesting one is, you have this big number, $500 billion Stargate project. Is that enough to do what you want to do? I don't know. I think open-ended question in some ways is a function of energy prices too, which, if we double the number of megawatts needed in the US to embark on endeavors like this, the impact to prices, I think, is, a complete unknown. Someone trying to quantify what that impact is just taking a wild guess, and best to really just leave it with, it's a lot higher than we are today.
Right. Yeah, I think that kind of opens up some of the stuff that we talked about this week as well that would be nice to get your thoughts on, was the implied heat rates and how those are performing in the ERCOT North region. And we're, specifically just looking at ERCOT North 345 kilovolt hub, Houston Ship Channel, and for average June to September implied heat rates. So the electricity future divided by the
regional gas price. Yeah.
We're arranging regional, yes. Yeah. So regional gas price averaging for the June to September kind of peak demand months during the summer, implied heat rates about 20 to 21 MMBTU per megawatt hour for the next 3 years. And then in August 2025, we have a peak of over 29 MMBTU per megawatt hour. And just for context, the average real heat rate of U.S. natural gas units is about 7.7 MMBTU per megawatt hour. And peakers, so your units that are coming online less efficient, are roughly 10-ish. And so that 29, you're about 3x the least efficient gas peakers, or the average gas peakers, I should say. So I think maybe that's an opportunity for you to maybe add some color. What is that? Why does that matter? What does that actually mean?
Well, I think, it's not really just so we're clear, that's not a new dynamic that has followed these executive orders or really is even, this is many months old now. I'd have to go back and check, but that may even extend back into 2023, where you've got elevated implied heat rates. And it's not even just in Texas, but we'll stay on Texas for now. Essentially, what it is acknowledging more than anything else is renewable reliability issues. The forward power price is suggesting that I will have to more often than maybe I would like, turn on low efficiency gas units to cover the arse of the renewables that didn't show up because it was cloudy, because it wasn't windy. And, I think the really remarkable thing that stands out there is historically, if you went back and said, all right, where did, first of month power trade versus first of the month gas, the daily market becomes a different animal because power can essentially go up to infinity. And by that, I mean price caps, pick your ISO, ERCOT certainly has one. But in just first of the month markets or month ahead markets, you're going to find something that gets as low as even below 7, which makes no sense either. But, typically goes up to 10, 15, which is really the range of where peakers are. That 10 that we talk about, a 10 heat rate, that would be more towards the efficient end of the peaker range. There's a lot of them. Pick your market too. The upper Midwest, will leave ERCOT for a minute. It is for, decades had a large coal-fired power fleet that was pretty old. So over time, more and more of these gas peakers were built, and there's a lot of 8.5 to 10.5s across the Midwest. And then you get into places like Texas, and there's certainly enough near that 10 range, but on the hot days where it's not windy, you'll find that implied, or actually, sorry, I should say actual jump closer to 15, because there's some that are relatively small, 5, 10 megawatts, but they're more like 20s, some of them even 25s. Start fast, off fast, consume a ton to give you what you need in an instant. And those forward power markets with those implied heat rates are, I'm chalking it up to the renewable intermittency, but in some ways too, we've been for a few years now in this AI is coming, data centers are coming world. So a little bit of both, right? If I increase power load with no change to my base load, meaning reliable generation fleet, then I have to price to cover when I don't have what I was hoping I did.
Yeah, it's really an interesting time to evaluate, I guess, the speed of the AI / data center advancements. You have kind of this tech industry that is notoriously fast moving versus a energy infrastructure type of industry that is a little bit slower moving. And one of the quotes from President Trump's address to the World Economic Forum, I think, really pointed to the urgency to figure out this supply problem. And just kind of the quick one is, and the big problem is we need to double the energy we currently have in the United States for AI to really be as big as we want to have it. So I think that the new administration is definitely making AI a priority. They had additional executive orders yesterday to say we want to be the AI capital of the world, and associated kind of orders to deliver that. But I think it definitely, at least for me, I wonder about the speed of how these get deployed and how well people can understand the limitations, as you mentioned, of renewables, say in Texas, where in your peak demand months of summer, that's typically when you have your lowest wind. And that presents another problem for facilities who are, at least to the media, saying, hey, we're going to rely mostly on wind. I think there's definitely that type of commentary that leads to the upside risk to reliability / prices that is still not really reflected in where people are kind of positioning themselves. So I think maybe we can leave that there for the power side. What do you say we turn to some of the commentary
that's
about
my favorite quote of the week. I'm going to ask Saudi Arabia and OPEC to bring down the cost of oil. I mean, like clockwork. I think within the first few weeks of the first term, he was on Air Force One heading to Saudi Arabia to sit down with MBS and make a deal. And while that hasn't happened just yet, right out of the gate, and it's something that we've talked about for many weeks, while the market's focus has been more on tariffs, and we can cover that maybe in a bit, between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Our suggestion to, and clients will have heard this likely if we've had a sit-down discussion, really what you should be paying attention to is the relationship with Saudi Arabia. And interestingly, the first comment is really paired with the campaign trail of doing what the outgoing administration couldn't do, at least in his words, those aren't mine, meaning keep energy prices down for the consumer. There's a long laundry list of the quotes that are even more specific on that topic. I think the really interesting piece to it, and has been, I guess, confirmed by some of the energy majors in the US, is the economics, meaning forward prices are going to determine what we do, not in an executive order. Opening up federal lands doesn't really change anything. They've got plenty of acreage that could be drilled. Why go somewhere else? I guess maybe if you give it away for zero, but then that becomes an interesting argument. Like, wait a minute, thought we were making America great again. How are we giving things away for free? I think overall the relationship between Saudi and the US as it relates to oil policy is most relevant when it comes to exports. And that's the thing, and kind of tying this back to what we opened with, the executive orders and the national emergency. I think export projects are the big one. The more we have the ability to export, be it products or, the feedstock, crude itself, the more we are a threat and a challenge to OPEC at large and the Saudis. And so there's quite possibly a conflict brewing here. And when your opening remark is saying you're asking for a favor, knowing that on, just a few days before, I guess a day before, you're talking about how we're going to export more and make more. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see the Saudi response to this.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially as we talked about before, when I guess two things. One, US still has kind of the domestic demand uncertainty. And second part of that is how can the US producer adapt to new supply from Saudi Arabia? What's the level where we can continue producing?
I think it's a pretty simple equation. OPEC's got at least 2 million barrels on the sidelines, and the global demand growth rate of somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million barrels a day per year, which we've talked about before, is incredibly reliable in non-recovery years. And so if you take the OPEC, let's say range of possible outcomes, 2 million at 4 million, that's what they could do over a 2 to 3 year period. Well, they can cover the first 2 years, maybe 3. And then where does that leave the US? We know that we can grow over 1 million barrels a day, with the right price signal. And I think both sides, be it OPEC or, we'll just even cast a wider net. We'll say North America. North America's ability to deliver 1 million barrels a day plus over a 3 year period, meaning consistent growth rate at that level, is almost guaranteed at the right forward curve. So too is OPEC's. Mm-hmm. So we're, you look at that and we're good out a decade. So, I think the battle, that's what I kind of mean by the battle that's brewing. Who gets the, next spare spot? Yeah. Who gets the incremental barrel of demand? And then there's the other piece of, we've been building refineries in the Middle East and China at a pretty rapid clip over the last 3 to 5 years. Man, built a single known in the US, actually retired capacity. So the world doesn't need oil. The world's never needed oil. The world needs product, and thus it needs oil for the product. But, it's kind of an interesting one. Like, who do you send that to? Who needs that barrel? And, the most recent example of that, barrels headed to Nigeria because of an internal dispute between Nigerian oil producers and the new refining complex. Ultimately, those get worked out. So do you lose a home? So I don't know. I think the next things to keep an eye on, what's this relationship? How does this evolve between the Trump administration and, let's just be clear, MBS? And then, are there any new pockets in the world where refineries start to pop up? And while refineries were listed in the, I guess, pile of items that are to be addressed, according to these executive orders, it's a pretty long putt to build a new refinery in the US. Even those that strongly oppose the Green New Deal, sorry, I'll go back and use maybe a dated moniker, there's still a pretty consistent prevailing anti-refinery outlook meaning popular opinion would probably want to kill them. So does Mexico begin a wave of refinery build-outs? I think probably less likely in Canada. And then when you start moving beyond, does India have a sizable refinery build-out that is coming in the next several years?
Yeah, it's kind of like the next 3-year outlook is just totally dominated by either Asia or the Middle East, but really just Asia. The last 12 years has been pretty much exclusively those same two regions. So it will be kind of interesting to watch that. I wonder, the SPR, we're, in the last year or so down to the lowest in 40 years after the 180 million barrels that were released
22,
in 22, I believe it was. Yeah. And, I think the U.S. preferred slate, as we talked about with Sarah, encourage people to go listen to that. I think we've used quite a bit of Saudi crude in the past. Is there something there where it's Saudi, increased production, refill SPR?
Yeah, I mean, it works until it doesn't. It's like a really interesting one. We got, let's just say, a couple 100 million barrels of spare space in the SPR. I mean, you can go further back in the time machine, and you could say there's somewhere between 200 and 300. And, as Trump has even said as much, we're going to drill, baby, drill, and we're going to fill, baby, fill. So, I think the SPR refill pace is another really important one to watch. It's a very clear tailwind in the near term. And that's what I mean by it works until it doesn't. There's easily, you could put in 5 million barrels a week for quite some time, and that would take a massive amount of U.S. supply off the market. Filling the SPR with a bunch of light barrels doesn't really do a whole lot for our refining complex. I mean, there's plenty of heavier sour barrels here, but not to get to a 5 million barrel per day, per week sort of refill rate. But it is a very interesting tailwind in the near term. Each weekly DOE petroleum status report will be important relative to the SPR fills.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be an interesting one to watch there. Also with some broader macro themes related to that, Abraham Accords being one of those. But I think maybe we can jump back to the natural gas side and get a little breakdown of what has been going on this week.
How exciting. 2 years in a row, like clockwork. Maybe it's scheduled MLK weekend comes and intense cold drops down from Western Canada and blankets the lower 48. This year's version, a bit colder than last. And while it looks like we will not match the withdrawal rate from that peak cold last year, which I believe is 326 BCF for that week, we should be very near to slightly above the 300 mark. And, this week's EIA inventory report was a surprise on the low side. So maybe it's made up for. When there's almost inexplicable market misses, there's a pretty decent track record of a subsequent week swinging back the other direction, whether it's a stated revision or not. Significant cold. And I think the key takeaways are the producing community did a far better job than it has historically of keeping volumes online. And maybe that's the driver of a lesser withdrawal, with somewhat comparable cold. At the peak last year, we lost more than 10% of U.S. dry gas production. This year, the peak looks like it's closer to 6-7%. Now, while the duration of the freeze-offs are still unknown, while it's warmed up substantially, there can be lingering effects. Last year's event took 10 days to, kind of be fully complete, meaning before you got production all the way back to where it was pre-storm. And jury's still out on that. But in general, better flowing supply. Daily withdrawals were still top 10 going back over the last decade, meaning a sample of daily facilities. So it'll be exciting to see what next Thursday's storage number is. And the other, two actually that remain on the list is, and I'll finish with these, probably the two most important takeaways from the wake of Winter Storm Enzo. Number one, power demand, meaning power burn, not power load, consumption of natural gas from the power sector increased to a level that was 5 BCF more than a similar day last year. Gas intensity goes up every year, almost like clockwork, almost regardless of the pricing environment. Over the last decade, while there are a few examples of prices having a material impact, 2014, when the coal-fired generation fleet was much larger and you were much, call it $2 higher than the 2012 environment, using a round number there. In 22, higher prices had no effect. And it's important in that it will have ramifications in summer 25 if there's any semblance of cold that bleeds back into the forecast February or March, and in season ending inventory estimates drop to 1.5 TCF or lower. Quick comment there. Most of the market started with I'll call it a 185 to 205, 1.85 TCF to 2.05 TCF end of March inventory estimate. And those have come plummeting lower. Quick sanity check for anybody that's seen that sort of change land on their desk. If anybody's telling you it's only because it's cold, one would need to pause for some broader reflection. While Winter Storm Enzo brought extreme cold to almost all of the lower 48, the winter to date HDD count, meaning actual plus even the 15-day forecast, which still has some cold in it, is still below normal by almost 50 HDDs. So it has not been cold. So there's the power piece, the end of season piece. Sorry, I said there's two. Maybe there's three. I'm just excited about this one. Salt storage. So salt storage, as of the most recent inventory report, 297 BCF in the ground. I guess stating this again, when somebody listens to this, it's January 24th, and the most recent storage report was yesterday, January 23rd. 297 BCF in salts. Last year in Q1, the lowest we got was about 50 BCF away. And this next storage report, which covers the week that Winter Storm Enzo said all available resources, please help, power, gas, you name it. The withdrawal is going to be at least 50 BCF, and according to a sample of daily facilities we track, it could be above 65. When you get this far out on the scale of historical observations, it becomes a little more difficult to pinpoint, well, what does this mean? My model doesn't work as well out here on the tail. But the point is, we're going to be below last year's Q1 trough, and we still got 9 weeks of winter left. Historically speaking, when salts get down to 150 BCF, it is problem time. Absolute inventory levels are what get covered most. We started there ourselves. But the salt inventory level at the end of the day has a great deal to do with physical market pricing in regions even well beyond where those salts exist, which is the Gulf Coast, and also, the very front of the curve pricing dynamics. If you need an example of that, your time machine only has to go back to the fall of 24, when salts were overly full relative to the absolute level for the lower 48, and easy to go back and take a peek at how weak the pricing environment was. So I don't know. Sorry, this is my turn to be not concise. Winter Storm Enzo, impacts were material. What comes next? Weather models say that there could be another similar event loading up in Western Canada. There's been quite the flip-flop on the final pane of weather model output this week. And generally speaking, the cold that is staged in Western Canada is still there, meaning the month of February could have another one, much like what we got in January.
Yeah, and that's the 11 to 15 day, I think you were saying.
Still got some significant cold.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. Salt storage, I think that's good context. I think the other, across the pond, interesting thing that came down this week for natural gas stories was the largest week-on-week withdrawal in EU gas inventories since February of 2021. And aggregate inventories are down to below 60%. And that is after starting 95% on November 1st. So EU is definitely seeing kind of some rapid depletions, even though they're having mild weather as well. And I think we talked about this earlier this week. We were just discussing some of the drivers of that. And, we have one coming from Russian pipeline gas shut off on January 1st through Ukraine. That's about 1.35 BCF a day in the kind of average for December. But then, interestingly, something we've talked about quite a bit this year is what's going on in Germany. And because Germany shut down their nuclear reactors, now relying for thermal generation on coal and natural gas. And big problem for Germany has been the kind of up and down of wind generation over the winter. And even though temps were fairly mild in the last couple of weeks, the collapse in wind speed, so, kind of just rough number, 70% of Germany's load was met by wind in the first week of January. The last 2 weeks is below 10%. So pretty big drop, and definitely a lot of interesting stuff there. But TTF jumped 8% week over week. And I think there's, potential to see some interesting stuff go down there with Germany having their February 23rd election for the new chancellorship. And then, still have not really seen significant sustained cold in Europe without Russia. So that'll be one to watch. Do you have any thoughts on Europe? And
I think you covered it really well. I think just the only comment I'll add is, presently you've got this rally in TTF, like you pointed out. It's got the front of the TTF curve trading $1 over Asia, which is pretty fascinating. It costs a lot more to get a North American MMBTU to Asia than it does to Europe. So, strange times in all fronts. That relationship between the two, if they, for whatever reason, begin to race each other, if they're just playing leapfrog, the absolute levels start climbing such that the U.S. might look over there and say, or either direction and say, well, wait a minute, we're too far behind. And by that, I mean consumer in either destination market, Asia or Europe, say, well, this spread's incredibly wide. I think I'm bid for the MMBTU in the homeland, and I'll sell it here, whatever transportation arb I have, I'm utilizing at this spread. It's I think that what you're really highlighting there with the European inventory drawdown and tying that with Winter Storm Enzo and the risks that are still out there for this winter is the fireworks may not be over. And looking back at 23 and 24, I think if you're going to draw a conclusion, it's the same conclusion that I guess you should arrive at before winter starts every year. Mother Nature is going to determine where we go. And mind you, it has not been cold in either place yet. So there's I think an important takeaway. Just not warm equals higher prices. So far, that's true of Europe and the U.S.
Yeah, and some interesting stuff will come down with the tariff conversations. One of the headlines today, JERA, Japan's one of their utilities, saying we're going to increase our purchases of U.S. LNG cargoes, potentially going to have to compete with Europe if that whole kind of negotiation tactic goes down as intended. So it'll be pretty interesting to watch, something that at least kind of keeps it interesting. So with that, I think we wrap it up and call this week's episode.
Sounds good.
All right.
Good to be with you again. See ya.
All right. See you next week. Thanks for joining us at the Energy Desk. Again, this is a limited series. So if you want to hear more episodes, you'll have to let us know by hitting follow wherever you get your podcasts or by sending me a message at amelvin@mobiusriskgroup.com. See you soon. And please keep in mind, this commentary contains our views and opinions and is based on information from sources we believe are reliable. This commentary is for informational purposes, should not be considered investment advice, and is not intended as an offer or solicitation with respect to the purchase and sale of commodity interests, or to serve as the basis for one to decide to execute derivatives or other transactions. This commentary is not considered promotional material.